hardworking AP people. Let's go ahead and see if we can wrap up our second part of the Great Depression. This time we'll be focusing on Roosevelt and the New Deal. There's my trusty sidekick there. There's Kona. He'll guard us through hopefully less than an hour of this time. I'm going to see if we can get this done in 45 is what I'm going for. And I can see here I've already wasted 1 minute talking about next to nothing. So let's jump in. Hopefully you have your notes template up and you can fill in some notes while you watch this on the other side of your screen. So let's get going here. Okay, so I believe I've already covered the election of 32 in the previous recorded lecture here. Herbert Hoover running for re-election, but largely unpopular. The expectation was just about any Democrat was going to beat Hoover in 1932. And just to put a cherry on top of his poopy little pie here, 1932 was also the summer in which Hoover ordered the forced eviction of the bonus army. So we have Hoover ordering guys like Douglas MacArthur, who orders fixed bayonets and charge into these homeless camps of World War I veterans and their families. Prior to that, Eleanor Roosevelt, as FDR has been campaigning, Eleanor Roosevelt has been in the camps visiting the troops and commiserating with them, listening to their stories, eating with them, just offering a lot of sympathy. And so the narrative is, Hoover sent in troops, FDR sent in Eleanor. So the election results were no surprise, although Roosevelt's landslide victory was enough not just to raise some eyebrows, but to definitely change the overall tenor of with the party powers at the time here. Let's take another quick look at this, a huge coalition that Roosevelt put together, the Democrats really put together there. That's going to be a very powerful coalition that will keep the Democratic Party more often than not. It won't be without exception, but more often than not, the Democratic Party will be in power both in the White House and in Congress there through the majority of those years. Let's go ahead and take a look at FDR here. 1933 to 1945. He's going to die in 1945. But between those years there, Roosevelt is going to win 4 presidential elections, only president in American history to do that. You might remember that presidents are now restrained by a constitutional amendment limiting them to 2 full terms. So 4-term president here through the real key components of the 20th century here. Great Depression and the New Deal policies there. As we take a look at foreign policy in another lecture, Roosevelt is going to kind of pivot away from the imperialism of his predecessors with something called the good neighbor policy, attempting to restore relationships between the United States and particularly Latin America, and he'll have some success with that. Next one here, arsenal of democracy. So what's going to happen is the United States is going to avoid World War II, at least until Pearl Harbor, but Roosevelt will be pushing for a readiness campaign, and the United States will be investing heavily in rebuilding its military in the late 1930s, going deep into debt to do that as well, but that will ultimately be what will finally pull the United States out of the Great Depression. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor, and then through World War II. President Roosevelt will pass away just a few days before we see the first half of those victories. So he will not see the unconditional surrender of Germany or Japan. He will pass away just prior to that. Okay, let's go ahead and get into Roosevelt and the New Deal here. So prior to this, Roosevelt is governor of New York. He was seen as a progressive reformer at that point. He's coming from a very wealthy family, but his bout with polio in 1921, and he's going to end up spending about 2 years in bed just relearning how to, he put, how to move his big toe. So he'll be permanently disabled from that. But another thing that will come from that is he will begin to have the capacity to commiserate and understand how ordinary people can struggle. And so Roosevelt's going to be Ivy League educated, silver spoon, millionaire family. He's also going to pick up some skills and how to sympathize and empathize with people who have fewer disadvantages of that. And those understandings combined with his political skills and a great deal of charisma, it's going to make him an extremely effective and powerful president for the middle of the 20th century here. Roosevelt is going to be promising, he calls it a New Deal. That's his campaign slogan. He never really completely fleshes that out while he's campaigning. It's somewhat vague. And as president, what we find out, the New Deal means a little bit of everything. Roosevelt is not going to be the opposite of Hoover. He'll hang on to what may be working from the Hoover administration and just add a whole bunch more to that. So something of a shotgun approach. He'll take advice from a variety of people in what he calls his brain trust. And if it works, great, throw some more money at it. If it doesn't work, well, get rid of that one. And in the 1930s, the American people are going, for the most part, they're going to be able to tolerate that sort of shotgun approach and even being willing to accept a failed program or perhaps even a program that backfired on us. A famous humorist in the era, his name was Will Rogers, and the way Rogers put it was that the whole country is with Roosevelt just so he does something. If he burned down the Capitol, we would all cheer and say, well, at least he got a fire started anyhow. So the optimism and the willing to accept that Roosevelt might not be batting 1,000 all the time. He might have some failed programs, but the energy and the fact that changes were coming was enough for many people to kind of put their hope and their optimism in the direction of Roosevelt there. Famous excerpt from his inaugural address. He says, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that phrase there is fairly prescient. You can think back at what was happening with the banks and how panicked people were lining up to withdraw their money from the banks, thus ensuring the bank would fail. You had businessmen who were afraid that the economy was contracting, and so they went ahead and laid off another round of people to guarantee that the economy would indeed contract. So Roosevelt's on the money here when he talks about the lack of confidence in the country and in each other, and he more often than not has the ability to get Americans to kind of reassert a little bit more confidence and a little bit more optimism. One of the ways he does that is he's going to speak directly to the American people through the medium of the radio. Now, the radio had just begun to get popular in the 1920s, but in the 1930s, what's going to happen is, I believe the statistics are in 1930, about 40% of all Americans had at least one radio in their home. By the end of the decade, by 1940, that number is going to go to 90%. So some 3/4 of all Americans are going to say they get their news from the radio. Listening to the radio is going to be a nightly event. And so Roosevelt using the radio to give these presidential addresses, these broadcasted fireside chats, he called them, with his particular political skill and charisma, that's going to bolster his support. That's going to allow him to get his agenda directly out to the American people. So that's going to work really well for him politically. One more thing about the Brain Trust there. This is mostly a group of advisors that he brought with him from New York, but he'll also pick some other people up in this so-called monopoly of big brains there. And there'll be some first timers here. We'll have a Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, will be the first female full cabinet member, and there'll be a variety of other people in Roosevelt's cabinet and his list of advisors that will give him a really wide variety of ideas about programs. And then finally on this page here, we're going to enter into what some people call alphabet soup. There's just so many different programs here. So sometimes it's helpful to put them into three categories here: relief, recovery, and reform. So of all of the programs, a relief program would be something designed to simply make Americans suffer less. So, if you will, a painkiller for the suffering of Americans. These are typically exactly the kind of programs that Hoover refused to support. Remember that Hoover was unwilling to allow federal spending to directly help the American people. He had a big hang up about that. Roosevelt doesn't have that hang up. So if you see a program that doesn't necessarily dramatically change unemployment numbers or offer anything really long term or change the rules, so to speak, but it does make people suffer less, that's going to be a relief program. Another type of program or another group of programs would be recovery programs. Now, these are typically the most expensive programs because what they are trying to do is they are trying to reduce the unemployment rate by having the federal government hire potentially millions of people. So these are going to be programs like the WPA, which will be spending billions of dollars building things like roads or courthouses or bridges or perhaps a very large dam project like Grand Coulee Dam. And the idea here is that number one, this is going to be lasting infrastructure that the country is going to benefit from. We're going to build our economy on modern roads, on new buildings, and umpteen trillions of watt hours coming from hydroelectric dams coming out of places like Grand Coulee Dam. So those are going to be great for the economy. But in the meantime, what that's going to do is that's going to put a good sized paycheck in the hands of millions of Americans. And they're going to take that paycheck and they're going to go out and spend it. And when they spend those paychecks, that's going to inspire the private industries, the private companies to hire people because they're going to have a new demand for the products and the services they're selling. So sometimes we use the phrase priming the pump. The old-fashioned water pump, sometimes you had to dump a little bit of water down them in order to get them to pump on their own. So Uncle Sam here is dumping some water down the pump. It's spending some money in order to get the economy running, and then hopefully eventually the government can taper off on that priming and the economy is just running on its own again. And then finally, reform. A reform program is designed to take a look at the structure of laws and the way things work and to look at it and say, what can we put in place here to make sure another Great Depression doesn't happen? So, for example, the banking industry was almost completely unregulated, and that allowed banks to take out or give out risky loans and let people buy on margin. It also let banks take your savings account and lend it out to somebody who would gamble with it on the stock market. So programs, not programs, but laws that would regulate banks. That would be a reform program. Also, something that would create a permanent social safety net to make sure that the elderly or very poor people didn't fall between the cracks once again. Something like Social Security, that'd be an example of a reform program. We'll get into some more of those in a little bit later. But for now, remember relief, recovery, reform, the 3 R's. All right, what's next here? The 100 days, and sometimes you'll even see that capitalized. The moment that Roosevelt takes office, he's going to give us that famous inaugural address, and then he is going to get right to work. And that first 100 days from March of 1933 through June of 1933, more new legislation is going to be passed in those 3 months than an entire term of a presidency before this. So 3 months of Roosevelt and the New Deal is going to produce more new laws, new programs, new legislation than 4 years of any other prior president there. So obviously a period of intense activism. And please don't forget that Roosevelt has this enormous benefit. Number one, he won the presidency in a landslide election, but Democrats all through Congress did the same thing. So Roosevelt is going to have his political party very dominant in both the House and the Senate. And so he's going to be able to move legislation through both houses of Congress very quickly, very efficiently there. So that allows him to move quite quickly. So what's he going to do? As soon as he gets going here, first day, right away, he is going to ask Congress for the Emergency Banking Act. He's going to close America's banks down. He's going to call it a bank holiday, and he's going to send in the auditors. Now, many of these banks were doing things that were not outright illegal because there's not many laws yet, definitely unethical. So sweetheart loans going out to friends or bank officials, crazy risky loans being given out. So a variety of things were happening within America's banking system that was endangering people's deposits and endangering confidence in the whole thing. 1,300 banks failed in 1930, 2,000 banks in 1931. So 32, 33, Roosevelt was looking at the possibility of the entire banking system in near total collapse. So he closes them down and sends in the auditors, gets on the radio with a fireside chat, and he tells the American people what he is up to. And he says the banks will reopen, at least the solvent banks will reopen. He says if your bank reopens, it has his stamp of approval on it. This is a solid financial institution. They have made sound decisions with your deposits, and you should trust your money in these banks when they reopen. And sure enough, when the banks did reopen after that bank holiday, there was a line of potential customers waiting to do their banking, but the majority of them were actually depositing what money they had, not getting further withdrawals. So Roosevelt's political skills and his charisma put a halt, at least temporarily, to the run on the banks. And he will backstop that eventually with something called FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to make sure that banks are insured, or at least your deposits are insured. Okay, what else is on here? The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FARA there. So what this is once again kind of the opposite of what Hoover would be willing to do. FERA is going to be about $500 million that's going to go straight to the states, and they can distribute that money however they want to, whatever form of relief they wanted to. Remember, Hoover is unwilling to provide federal relief right away. Roosevelt's going to go, bam, here is your relief right here. Okay, looking down the list here, the CCC is going to be an extremely popular program that Roosevelt will get pushed into law in his first 100 days. You might have benefited from the CCC already if you have ever, say, gone to Hayburn State Park or walked a trail on Mount Spokane or other places as well. That's some of the lasting infrastructure that's left from the CCC. What this program was designed to do was to take young men who were probably unemployable given the contraction of the economy and put them to work across the country, cutting fire trails, building parks, doing soil erosion correction in the Midwest, and a variety of other environmental activities. And it was, room, shelter, clothing, a uniform, fun in the evenings, and what it did is it gave, gosh, what was it? I think 2.5 million. Yeah, 2.5 million men at one point or another were involved in the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it even gave them a little bit of money in addition to this. It gave them about $30 a month. These are young guys who were probably still living at home and felt completely worthless as human beings as they were unable to contribute to their parents' economic problems because they couldn't get jobs. Well, now they have a full-time gig in the CCC and they're able to send some of that $30 a month back home to their parents to help their parents make ends meet there. So it was an enormously popular program. In fact, the only reason why it went away was the United States entered World War II, and we needed those young men to put on a different kind of uniform at that point. Okay, another one here is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. This was designed to help farmers. Now, this wasn't a perfect program. It was intended to bolster crop prices in order to help farmers pay their bills. And so it paid them a subsidy to not grow or to grow less. And that subsidy came from a tax on the processing plants. Now, the downside of the Agricultural Adjustment Act is going to be that if you are a sharecropper, you get nothing. This only went to the landowners. And so this had the negative effect of kicking sharecroppers off the land and making things even worse for some of the very poorest people in the entire country. On the other hand, it did bring crop prices up a bit, and so landowners got some relief from it. Next one here, National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, and within the NIRA comes a couple of big programs. First off, PWA, Public Works Administration, which is going to be the first of our big construction infrastructure programs here. Federal government's going to be spending some $4 billion on this program, roads, buildings, courthouses, big construction projects there. This is an example of one of those priming the pump recovery programs. Remember the 3 R's. This is going to be a recovery program because of the amount of money spent building that infrastructure and creating all those jobs. And those jobs are going to create other jobs in the private industries as well. The next one here, National Recovery Administration, NRA, a different NRA than you might be familiar with here. This one was pretty much just a full-on failure. What it tries to do is set a series of codes that factories and employers are supposed to abide by. And these codes are supposed to be about labor and production methods and things that are supposed to, if you abide by the codes, it's supposed to improve the economy. And if you jump through all those hoops, you are allowed to put a Blue Eagle sticker or stamp on the item that you were selling. And then the federal government would advertise to the American people, only buy things with the Blue Eagle on it. It ends up being really complicated. It doesn't do a heck of a lot of good. And ultimately, the Supreme Court will throw it out and declare it unconstitutional. And then the final one at the very bottom here is a success. This is the Tennessee Valley Authority. If you take a look at the map directly to the right, this guy right here, this region is one of the poorest regions in the United States. It's still a relatively poor region compared to some other parts of the United States. But the Tennessee Valley Authority came in and built a series of hydroelectric dams in the region. Those hydroelectric dams are going to create very inexpensive electricity, and that's going to entice businesses to relocate in there. It's also going to redesign a whole bunch of communities, as those dams will flood areas, and it will cause the need to relocate people as well. So this is still a program that's happening. Many people in this region still buy their electricity from the TVA, and it did have the result of improving the overall economy in this pretty poor, about 5 or 6 state region around the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so 1933, 1940, 34. This is what becomes known as Roosevelt's first New Deal. He's going to come back after the midterm elections and have a second New Deal. A couple other things that we're going to be looking at here. You can see the alphabet soup is still going strong. Within the Banking Act of 33 are going to be a couple of important things. The Glass-Steagall Act is going to regulate banks. It's going to tell banks that they cannot take your savings deposits and lend them out to people who are investing in the stock market. If a bank wants to provide loans for people that are speculating on the stock market, it has to do it with separate money than depositors' money. So it's separating deposits from investments. This one here, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, that was still around. In fact, if you go to the bank, you might see the little sticker somewhere next to where the teller is talking to you. This is providing insurance for your bank deposits. So even if your bank does fail, the federal government, the same people that printed the money in the first place, are going to guarantee that your deposits will be returned back to you. You'll get all your money back up to $250,000 per bank account there. So FDIC is going to restore confidence in the banks. Gold Reserve Act is going to begin the process of taking the United States off of the gold standard. And so that's going to allow the government to get some more money into circulation and try to put a dent in some of the deflation that was harming the economy so badly during the time. Farm Credit Administration, so we're looking for some loans here and some credit for farmers. Again, tackling the problem of farmers losing their land, not being able to pay their mortgages, so be able to reestablish some credit for farmers. Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, is going to regulate the stock market. So the federal government can oversee the stock market. There is a set of laws now that corporations and investors have to abide by on the stock market. If they violate those laws, because those can be punished with even prison time. So this is going to attempt to try to cut out some of the tricks and the ways that people in the stock market were trying to fool other investors in order to gain a profit from that. Okay, National Labor Relations Board and the National Labor Relations Act is going to be a huge benefit for labor unions. Labor unions are going to be protected now by the federal government, and workers under the National Labor Relations Act are going to have the right to vote on whether or not they want to join a labor union and pursue collective bargaining. That's going to be done with federal government protection. So the number of union members is going to skyrocket during the Roosevelt years. Okay, Federal Housing Administration, this is another one that's still around today. This is going to help first-time home buyers secure that very first loan. It can be very difficult to convince a bank to lend you $400,000 for the very first time. And so the Federal Housing Administration is going to offer banks insurance for first-time home buyers, and that's going to help boost real estate across the United States and get more people buying homes. And of course, if people are buying homes, that means a lot of people go to work. Okay, and then finally, really good news here for Native Americans here. The super terrible Dawes General Allotment Act will be reversed with this Indian Reorganization Act right here. What this is going to do is going to allow Indian tribes to once again reassert tribal leadership over reservations here. And it's not going to be like a light switch. It's going to take a few decades, but this is going to be the beginnings of some recovery for Native Americans. As you recall, the turn of the century in the 1890s was a really, really terrible time for Native Americans. So we are heading in the right track, giving Native Americans tribal sovereignty once again with the Indian Reorganization Act. All right. Good news for all of those drinkers on St. Patrick's Day there. The 21st Amendment is going to be a repeal of prohibition. So the 18th Amendment is going to be nullified by the 21st Amendment here. So this is the end of prohibition. Prohibition did reduce the amount of alcohol being consumed, but it had a couple of negative consequences that were unintended and many people considered far worse. Number one, it created a massive black market, billions of dollars of revenue for criminals willing to supply that alcohol for a still thirsty crowd of Americans. In particularly the cities like Chicago, it's going to result in a rash of murders and violence as organized crime fight for territory for selling of alcohol and other things. It's also going to mean a loss of revenue for the breweries and the distilleries that were doing things above board. So to end prohibition will instantly put thousands of breweries back online. Well, maybe not thousands of breweries, but thousands of workers in those breweries online. It's going to restore some employment there. And then, of course, speakeasies, those secret pubs and saloons, never really quit selling alcohol, even though it was illegal there. So the unintended consequences of prohibition outweighed the need to keep it around any longer. And so Americans have their right to purchase alcohol restored in 1933. Okay. Roosevelt, big dramatic steps here, making huge waves here. Roosevelt was looking forward to that midterm election to see if the American people appreciated what he was doing or if they thought that he was on the wrong track. And Republicans obviously hoping to make some inroads in the House and the Senate. What happens instead is something that doesn't usually happen. Roosevelt is a Democratic president. Typically, what happens in the midterms is the president's party loses seats in the House and the Senate. What happened with Roosevelt was the opposite. The Democrats actually picked up more seats in the House and in the Senate. Roosevelt takes that as a sign that the American people like all of this New Deal stuff, and so he gives them another dose of it from 35 on forward there as well. So this is known as the Second New Deal. There's kind of a utopian ideal of picking up hundreds of thousands of farmers from the Dust Bowl and sharecroppers and resettling them into new communities. Not much money was put into it, but it was very idealistic. That was called the Resettlement Administration. One that did get a lot of money put towards it was the WPA. I believe this might be the most expensive of the New Deal programs here. Works Progress Administration. So once again, we've got more money going for post offices and courthouses and roads and bridges and things like that. But it's also going to target other unemployed Americans like artists, writers, theater producers, stagecraft people, a variety of different things, historians, all sorts of other um, skilled workers are going to be employed to do what they do, but this time for the federal government. So you can see there, Federal Writers Project, theater, music, arts, historical records survey, and we still have those records, which are really fascinating. So we're going to have written and audio recordings of firsthand accounts of people who lived through the Civil War even are going to be recorded in some cases. So pretty amazing stuff that we're still benefiting from. Rural Electrification Administration is going to string those electrical wires to farm communities and get more people hooked up to the grid. Social Security, really important deal here as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act, giving us the opportunity to set a federal minimum wage, and again having labor unions protected, and your right to pursue a collective bargaining contract is protected as well. So some big changes there. Have a closer look at this on your own. Make sure that you're familiar. I would say, if you could get familiar with, at least 2/3 of these, that'd be a great thing to do. Okay, some art from the New Deal. Upper left, there's some of the promotion for the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, variety of other things. An example of how federal government employed artists, not just to do art on their own, but to do art to promote more New Deal programs as well. Here are some of the murals. Examples of the WPA, things like that on that one. Federal Run Writers Project there, stage play, variety of other things there. All right, let's go ahead and keep moving. People opposed to the New Deal. So Roosevelt's going to have his fair share of critics. Won't stop him from getting reelected, but these people will be thorns on both his left and his right flank here. Some people are going to say that Roosevelt and the New Deal is taking America away from its capitalistic underpinnings. A group called the American Liberty League of Republicans and Conservative Democrats are going to accuse the president of undermining the Constitution itself. They don't get a whole lot of traction in this era. This is going to be mostly critics who are wealthy, and there's just too many Americans that are not wealthy during this time, too many unemployed Americans for this group to really gain much traction there. What perhaps is a little bit more interesting are the people saying that Roosevelt isn't going far enough, and he ends up having some very interesting critics that are demanding that he make bigger and more bold changes. The guy with his fists in the air, that's Father Coughlin, who used to support Roosevelt but grew impatient with Roosevelt, and I think he was a little bit upset that his own audience wasn't growing. He had a radio program, and so he took his radio program and his criticism of Roosevelt, and he started talking about how Roosevelt was catering to the communists and catering to the Jewish bankers. He started in on a real anti-Semitic tirade, and kind of took things a potentially dangerous direction. Another one of Roosevelt's critics from California. This guy worked a little bit with Upton Sinclair, the guy who wrote The Jungle. Francis Townsend was also from California, and he was a retired doctor and just saw how badly the Depression had hit senior citizens. And so he proposed a deal where the federal government would issue something like cash, but it would have an expiration date on it. And it would be the equivalent of $200 a month for every person over the age of 60, but they had to spend it within the 30 days of the month or else it would expire. The idea is, of course, this would first and foremost end poverty for senior citizens. $200 a month in the 1930s would be a really handsome amount of money. But it would also, as they spent that money, it would stimulate the economy as well. And it would all be paid for by a 3% tax on pretty much everything that existed. So the program wasn't super well thought out. The 3% tax would create all sorts of hiccups and problems overall there. But it had millions of senior citizens that liked the sound of it, and they supported it quite strongly. And then in Louisiana, we had a politician named Huey P. Long, who's known as the Kingfish. And this guy was really entertaining to watch and listen to. And he talked about how America was like the Lord's barbecue. And we had this smorgasbord of wealth, of food for all of us. But J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller and those kind of people had taken 85% of the victuals off the table, and it's time to tell them to put that back. So he called it Share Our Wealth, and Huey P. Long was really making a run toward the presidency, challenging Roosevelt in the mid 1930s, a run in the 36 election. Long was actually assassinated, and that will put a pretty dramatic end of his run for the presidency. But in the meantime, though, all these guys, Coughlin, Townsend, Huey P. Long, they get the attention of Roosevelt that he needs to move even more aggressively than he had been doing before. And many people would say that Upton Sinclair and Francis Townsend, combination of both of them, are going to be very influential in pushing Roosevelt to get the Social Security Act passed, which was much smaller and more conservative than the ideas that they had in mind, but designed to do something similar. Okay, so Roosevelt, 1936. Some people are even predicting that Roosevelt is going to lose this election. Again, couldn't have been more wrong. An even bigger landslide than 1932. Looks like, who is that up there? Maine and Vermont, I think, are the only ones that give the Republican challenger Alfred Landon any electoral votes at all. So 523 to 8. So there you have it, folks. The biggest landslide in American presidential election history, the election of 1936. Okay, so Roosevelt, unfortunately for him, though, he is going to run into some trouble with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was made up of some surprisingly old people. 6 of them were over the age of 70, and all of them had been on the court for quite some time. They had been installed on the court by the Gilded Age presidents, and many of them found Roosevelt's New Deal to be things that they didn't think the United States should have. So Roosevelt has a problem with the Supreme Court. They are going to throw out a couple of his key programs. They're going to throw out the NRA, the Blue Eagle program. They're going to throw out the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And they are also threatening to throw out Social Security as well. That's working its way up through the courts. So Roosevelt is going to ask Congress for the Justice Reorganization Bill. Critics call this his court packing plan. What Roosevelt would like to do is have the ability to add an additional justice for every current justice who happens to be over the age of 70. Since there's 6 of them over the age of 70, this would have given Roosevelt the opportunity to add 6 more justices to the court, guaranteeing that he would not have to worry about future laws being ruled unconstitutional, since he would be able to handpick those justices. Congress does not deliver on this occasion. Congress, for the first time, will tell Roosevelt no. When you can see the political cartoon there, Roosevelt is the ingenious quarterback saying, I want 6 substitutes at once. These fellows don't know it, but they're through. But I don't want to take them off the field. Congress, as the referee here, obviously is going to say, no, sorry, Mr. President, That's not the way the game works here. So Roosevelt does not get his 6 new justices. However, the Supreme Court begins to soften up a little bit on the New Deal programs. They spare um, Social Security and also the Wagner Act, which was about collective bargaining and unions and the minimum wage. They spare those. And of course, Roosevelt will stick around till 1945. And so many of these justices will either pass away or they will retire. And so Roosevelt, in the long run, will be able to replace them anyways. But for the short term, this is the important part, for the short term, for the first time, Congress, conservative Democrats and Republicans, were able to tell President Roosevelt no, and they got away with it. And so the next time they want to tell the president no, it's going to be easier and easier. And this, for Roosevelt, is going to be something of a brick wall. He will not be able to get Congress to pass new big programs after this. Okay, New Deal for labor. For labor unions, the New Deal is super, super huge. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, is going to strengthen in its size and membership, but there's going to be some upstarts in the AFL. You might remember that the AFL was a kind of white, male, skilled only group of workers. Well, there's a more radical group inside the AFL, and they are going to bolt away. This is John L. Lewis, and he is going to form the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And he is going to demand that women be allowed in, that blacks be allowed in, and perhaps just as importantly, that unskilled big industry workers, those factory workers on the assembly lines, that they get allowed in as well. And this is going to inspire some very large scale strikes in the 1930s, the most famous of which are the sit down strikes, where workers show up to work, they get into their workstation, and then they sit down. And that prevents the bosses from hiring scabs to keep the factories going. So some of these turn very violent. People will be killed. There'll be violence here. Ultimately, the United Auto Workers will be able to establish unions in the Ford and in the GM plants. And you're going to see unions established in the steel mills and other big industries as well. So you can see the chart, the spike in union membership, really dramatic during the Roosevelt years of the Great Depression. Then, of course, continuing into World War II as well. Okay, all right, we're at 48 minutes. I'm not going to be as fast as I hope I would here, so let me try to get a couple of important points through here about arts and entertainment, a few other things here. So, the word to remember for arts and entertainment is escapism. Americans want to get away from the reality of their troubles. They want fantasy. They want something that has very little in common with real life. So, when it comes to movies, Disney movies, Frank Capra movies, gangster movies, big shoot 'em ups, very fantastical things like The Wizard of Oz, Shirley Temple, precocious little girl who, turns everything into a musical, or the Marx Brothers, which is, very, very slapstick, very farcical comedy there. That's the kind of movies that Americans are going to want to see. And despite the fact that many Americans are struggling financially, many Americans, I think it's up to about 60% of Americans, are still going to see a movie at least once a week. Now, keep in mind that movies are very inexpensive. Your daytime movie, sometimes you can get in for a nickel, even for a matinee. And Americans will not give up their favorite type of entertainment, which are the movies. Here's the radios again, and the 1930s are going to see more broadcasting. So, broadcasting is going to start earlier in the day. We're going to have serialized dramas like The Shadow. So, spy shows and crime dramas, soap operas as well. So radio is going to be filled with nonstop entertainment there. Many of the radio stars are going to be out of work vaudeville performers. And we're even going to bring in the minstrel show performers as well. It's kind of hard to see someone in blackface over the radio, but they're gonna have white comedy duos like Amos and Andy take on the stereotypical affectations of African Americans and make a comedy out of that as well. Kind of working through this backwards here, but I'm sure you can handle it with me. Music, jazz is going to be going strong, but it's going to be somewhat co opted by white performers. And Benny Goodman is going to take a lot of the styles of jazz music and bring his, clarinet performance to it and bring it part of a big band. So jazz is going to kind of morph into a more white friendly swing sound, and that's going to stay really popular through World War II as well. So starts in the 30s but goes strong through the 1940s as well. In the country, you're going to see more folk music, and in the South, in the African American community, gospel music is going to be powerful as well. Woody Guthrie is by far the most famous of the folk musicians coming out of here, and he's going to be singing the stories. He's going to be writing these stories of working class common folk that are, fighting the good fight and, you know, taking it to the man and all of those sort of things there. Photography, we're going to have photographers that are going to be employed by the WPA. Dorothea Lange is going to take some extraordinary photographs of farmers and rural folks struggling to make ends meet, and those photographs are going to increase support for the fact that the federal government is spending money to help them out. In literature, I think I should bring up John Steinbeck, who's something of an investigative reporter, but he takes what he investigates and turns them into some very powerful novels, and two of them being The Grapes of Wrath and Mice and Men. And Grapes of Wrath has kind of become probably the best known dramatization of the Dust Bowl and farmers that are forced off the land in the 1930s there. And the Joad family gets kind of part of all American culture. You'll hear things about the Joad family, from Rage Against the Machine songs to gosh, I think the Veggie Tales did something on the Joad family, if you're familiar with either of those cultural references, as different as those are. Okay, in sports and recreation, WPA still spending some money here to keep some sports programs going, but a lot of the board games, jigsaw puzzles, Reader's Digests, these are ways to keep Americans entertained on the cheap. Reader's Digest, of course, just shortened versions of stories that are published on paperback, much less expensive. Jigsaw puzzles, I mean, it's just a cut up piece of cardboard. How expensive should it be there? So you can sort of see the impact of the Great Depression on some forms of entertainment there. Okay, end of the New Deal here. So what's going to happen? 1937, after the failure of Roosevelt's packing plan, Roosevelt and Congress are going to start cutting back on some of those big spending programs, hoping that the private economy is ready to take over, that the pump has been primed. Well, they were wrong. And as soon as we cut back on those programs, unemployment just jacked right back up again. The problem, though, was that Congress was not willing to go back and spend the money again. So unless some other thing happens, we were heading towards another major depression. Well, something else indeed did happen. That was the rise of totalitarian regimes across the world. Imperialist Japan, of course, Adolf Hitler, and Benito Mussolini in Europe. And what's going to happen here is the United States, whether it likes it or not, war is going to come to the United States. And so we are going to have to spend a lot of money, but not for building roads and bridges and courthouses and hydroelectric dams. We're going to be spending a lot of money on the equipment necessary to go to war. Okay, so I think that's about all we're going to do here. Let's see if we can call that good.